Hey there, listeners. Welcome to Hines on Air, your weekly dose of inspiration, motivation, and real-life entrepreneurial stories. I'm Matt Hines, your host, and I'm excited to have you join me on this journey. From building a successful law firm to venturing into other industries like real estate and social media, I've experienced both the triumphs and the challenges that come with entrepreneurship. I've learned firsthand the importance of resilience, adaptability, and a relentless pursuit of excellence. On Hines on Air, we're diving deep into the world of business, law, and personal growth. Join me as I chat with incredible guests who have faced adversity, defied expectations, and achieved extraordinary success. We'll discuss their strategies, their mindset, and the lessons they've learned along the way. Whether you're an aspiring entrepreneur, a seasoned business owner, or simply someone looking for a little inspiration, Hines on Air is for you. Remember to subscribe, like, and leave a review whenever you listen to podcasts. Your support helps us reach more people and continue sharing these incredible stories. Let's get started. Hey everybody, it is Matt Hines. We are back with another Hines on Air. Today is November 5th, 2024. Lots of exciting things today. You might have heard of a presidential race that is taking place, but also exciting, happy here on Hines on Air is Mr. Kurt Uhlir has joined us today. He is a master at setting up businesses, giving business advice. He is taking small companies to make them larger and also into, what's the largest company you mentioned to me earlier?
$1.44 billion in revenue in a year.
$1.44 billion. Those are numbers I haven't really even thought of. That is amazing, man.
It would be nice change in your pocket.
Yes, it would. It would. Well, listen, man, it's an honor to have you on the show, so thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You're welcome, man. All right, so we were talking just before the episode started, and some Matt came up that you had been an advisor to President Trump.
Yes.
On the first term.
On the first term.
So what do you do? What does an advisor do to a president?
Well, in that case, I wasn't a cabinet member or anything, but I was asked to come in and give advice on a very narrow topic that he had. Because, I'm sure he gets advisory for all sorts of things. And in my case, I was on the board and the chairman of the Made in America movement, basically Chamber of Commerce for the 3,000 companies that qualify for using the Made in America label in the United States. And so it was specifically, I want to help these companies. I think if I can help the whole economy, but if I can help this narrow 0.1% of companies that build everything here, that everybody else that builds stuff in other countries as well will also benefit. Can you give me guidance? And the White House asked 11 people, who should we bring in to help us put us counsel around us? And everybody either mentioned the Made in America movement or me by name. And so Margarita, who founded that organization, she was a little hesitant for some press stuff. And she said, y'all need to talk to Kurt. And so that was the specific topic was coming in as a business advisor in that case.
That is amazing. So did it inspire other companies to come back over and build factories here now?
They did a lot of that. That was some of the tariffs and some of the just helping from an economics perspective locally. But hoping, that will be continued, whether it's President Trump or whoever wins this next election.
Yeah, I would imagine it's not something that happens overnight.
It doesn't happen overnight. It was an interesting kind of concept too, because there are so many companies that it makes sense to build stuff in other countries and assemble things in other countries. But if you can help that narrow sliver that only does stuff here, or made in Japan or made in Germany, we all have a country of origin kind of process at countries. Well, if you help them, then the other 99% benefit as well.
How was that? So if you help companies that build everything here, how does it help somebody that manufactures things in China?
Well, let's think about Mercedes, who's moved their North American headquarters to Atlanta now.
Okay.
And so while they're not an American company, they have a headquarters here. They first entered building cars with their plant in Vance, Alabama. So by making things more amicable for Mercedes to build cars for North America here in the United States, then that's more jobs here. That's a better economic things, more of the dollars that on an M-Class, which is what they build in Vance, Alabama. When you buy an M-Class, more of those dollars stay both in Alabama, but within the United States than if it was being imported from other places.
Gotcha.
And so that's a great example because Mercedes is not a made in America company,
right,
but they do build products here.
Okay.
And so what's near and dear to my heart is we all think about made in America tends to be physical goods, but there's software as well. I have no problem. Right now I have people on my team in the Philippines and overseas in a variety of countries, but it's the same thing. If I'm going to go hire 100 software engineers, would I rather place them in Indianapolis or would I rather place them in another country? I'd rather place them here in the U.S. if I could.
Right. Do you see a big problem with the disparity in wages? Is that, an app, I think Tim Cook had approached Trump, speaking of Trump, one time was we can't afford to build over here because Samsung has some deal and
you're going to put this tariff on us, or you're going to do this, and they're getting this cheap labor. And if we can take advantage of that, we can compete with them. That's probably a jarbled version of the story, but essentially, when they're paying $5 an hour overseas and they're paying $15 an hour here, how do we compete with that?
It depends on a lot of different factors. I mean, as far as like tariffs, that's a whole different level of economics that I don't have the expertise in. But I do know for the first 150 years of our country, our federal government was entirely funded by tariffs. And so does that make sense going forward? Well, it could, and people smarter than me can help figure that out. But as far as wage disparity, it depends on a lot of things. Efficiencies matter as well. So both in the States, I have people on my team that work in the Philippines, and they do not earn the same thing as a content manager or writer here in the US, but my two main content writers and editors that I have live here in the United States. And so could I hire them and perhaps, save some money elsewhere? Yes, but I have people I've worked with before and my dollars make sense. And so from a disparity perspective, I don't care how much Tim Cook or Mark Zuckerberg earns. What I care about is how much I earn, how much my employees earn. And so it doesn't matter to me how much, the wealthiest of the wealthy earn elsewhere.
Well, that's good to hear. So you could earn the same and reach your goals even if you were paying someone in America double or whatever.
Absolutely. And there are things that make sense to outsource, but then it also depends on the culture. And so, certain countries are really good at just from a culture perspective, but it also takes knowing how to work with those countries as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I've worked with software engineers in almost every country, especially every continent you can think of outside of Antarctica. And it's I would have no problem running teams, whether it's in India, Indianapolis, or, Thailand. But some people would have an issue just because they haven't worked in some of those systems. And we do, on a generality, we're all individuals, but a lot of times we do work differently from a business perspective. And you need to have somebody train you about how to work remotely with those teams. And is it a good thing or not to have people, say, touching your code or helping write content for your law firm 24 hours a day, because you may have people working on 5 or 6 different time zones around the world? Well, it could be, but that's very different than if everybody's working the same roughly 9 to 5.
Right. That's right. That's right. All right. So Kurt, what I've read in your bio is that you're the king of scaling. Scaling for someone out here who's not used to that term is just basically growth of the business, right?
Growing a business, but also instead of trying to think about, so many times companies are trying to grow 5, 10, 15% a year, which is still good growth. Scaling is usually, hey, we're looking at how do we grow a company 50% or even 500% year over year over year. Things where you're really adding a bunch of people, a bunch of dollars, a bunch of revenue, not just a 10% growth year over year.
Okay, guys. Okay, good distinguishing there. All right, so to take a company, let's say 5X each year. I mean, I've looked at this and asked myself that 1,000 times. Is it a trend? Are they riding the momentum of a new product or what? Because my law firm, it's very competitive. I don't know how we would 5X in 1 year right now. Is there anything you've seen? I know there's probably not one answer to this. There's a billion, and how you apply them and who do you hire, all this kind of stuff. But what advice, or is it easy to summarize it, and what makes a company grow that fast?
I think there's a couple things, and a lot of it does come down to approach. It is one of those things that's more art than science, although there's science in how you approach it systematically.
Okay.
And the first bit is if you're just trying to grow your law firm 10% year over year, 20% year over year, you're going to approach looking for friction points in your business operations much differently than if I said, what would happen if I gave you 500% of the viable client leads starting January 1st? You would relook at everything very different than if you were just thinking about a 10% year over year growth.
Right.
You would think about, how does my front desk work? How do I follow up? How do I track cases? And so for me, the fundamental thing to start is, hey, it is slowing down and saying, hey, what would every part of my business look like if it grew by 200, 500, 1,000% in the next 12 months? That causes you to slow down and go, whoa, there's all these things that I think aren't that big of a friction point right now. But even if you don't grow by 200% next year, it's the difference between your law firm growing at 10% versus 20% next year, because you'll see these small case management things that you could improve that you otherwise would just discount because you're like, that's just 30 seconds here or there. And the other thing, which is kind of related to that, is I think everybody in the business should do this. And I mean, I do this in my personal life, is there, you have to take a practice of both you and everybody in your team and give them permission to do this. But to start to think about, what are at least 3 things that not just the law firm, say in your example, is wrong at, but what are the 3 things that you are wrong at today? And if you look back, Like at first you go like, I'm not wrong about any three major things. But if you look back, I'm sure today you'd go, gosh, over the last like 5 years, here's 2 or 3 ways that I approach running teams, interacting with my clients, showing up in court or other partners doing it. And you'd go, we were doing it this way because we thought it was the right way and it wasn't just we learned something else until we discovered something that was fundamentally changed how we did that. So when you take this small practice of 30 seconds, maybe even 90 seconds a day, just to ask yourself while you're brushing your teeth, what could I be wrong about today? Well, what happens is it creates in your mind something where you're looking for these little places that you could improve things. But when you find them or something that you suspect it could be, you have to voice that to everybody in your team as widely as you can, because no matter how much you may tell, if you want people are wanting to scale, no matter how much you may tell people on your team, if you see something, bring it to me, they're still going to be hesitant until you come to them and say, here's something that I was doing that I realized was wrong. Here's something I was doing that was wasting my time that fundamentally I should be handing off to you. And I realized that I wasn't. Until they actually see your actions of pointing out where you're wrong, they're not going to bring this wealth of places where you're going to go, oh my gosh, like y'all came with me with 12 ideas in the first 6 months of the year that are changing the firm, but they have to feel comfortable with it. And no matter how much I verbalize that, I try to tell people that until I am actually vulnerable and point out things that I'm wrong about, I don't see those responses come in. Because when people see something, it doesn't mean they're always right about what's wrong. What I want is the gut reaction. What I want is the gut reaction from one of the women that are my content editors on my team that says, this feels like it might be wrong. They don't even have a solution for it. Their solution's probably wrong. What I need is that gut feeling from them or something not quite right, and they can't identify it yet.
Okay. So me or management at some level going to everybody and just giving examples of how they made a mistake, you think that can encourage them to be more free-flowing with information?
Absolutely.
Because we all the time, and I would say weekly, I let them know they know more than me. Right. I know I'm where I am in the organization, and they're on the front lines, and they're seeing it.
Yep.
They're seeing all the details, and they could probably spot places where we can improve that I'm not going to be able to see. Right. So I ask them constantly, please make proposals, or make recommendations. We listen. I don't know that that's enough. Maybe we need to add what you just said.
There's how you celebrate and when people bring to you ideas. And it could be things in a process, but it could also be like, I'm really big on hiring people based on character traits that you would see in their actions. Not who somebody says they are, but things you would see. Like, I want somebody, a lawyer, you can probably appreciate this. I'll put in every one of my job descriptions. I want somebody who thrives with healthy conflict. People will apply just because they go, I don't even know what healthy conflict means. But I don't always represent that well myself. And so I was helped building one of the largest, what's now the largest residential real estate brokerage in the country. And there was something that came up with a peer of mine, Alan, where I did not handle the healthy conflict well. Alan and I were butting heads on something, and it was about 3 months where I should have approached him. And when I finally realized it, I looked back at these meetings and I was like, I was being unhealthy confrontation with Alan in meetings. So when I realized that, I went to him and I made right. And so to kind of reconcile, and I spoke to one of the product managers on his team, and he was like, oh, some of these meetings have been horrible to be in. So I kind of confirmed how bad it was. Well, I used that example of what was something that was wrong in the business where I had got it wrong in front of my entire major division at this large public company. And we used that example, and I had made sure everybody was okay with me giving an example. And I was like, so I tell you all, I want you to show up well. I want you to bring conflict. I want you to help somebody broker. And I was like, in this case, not only did I not do it well, I said, so then I look at his product manager here who was experiencing this firsthand, was just sitting back like y'all are going at each other meetings. He didn't bring up to either one of us and say, can you help fix this situation? And I was like, so this was a situation that I caused. It was causing a lot of conflict in the organization. And so I brought that up. 3 people by the end of that day came to me with similar personnel issues that had been going on for months that none of us knew about.
Wow.
And because I brought out that case where I had been wrong, they felt safe in surfacing things.
Nice. That's good.
So that happens whether you're a general contractor or a law firm or running a big SaaS technology company.
Right. Just the ability to communicate. We can't solve it if somebody just doesn't talk about it at first. I think people are so inclined to go to this person over here and bitch about it versus just actually addressing it in a, like you said, healthy conflict or whatever. Yeah.
Well, it's like, you you're trained in conflict. I mean, that's what law is. Some of things. It's like, is there any way to have to not have conflict? Yes. Never be around another person for the rest of your life.
Right.
If not, at some point, unless you and I are always in agreement on everything we do, at some point, well, there's going to be a disagreement. If I say right now, hey, let's go walk to Kennesaw Mountain. Well, if we get to a fork in the path and you think we should go left and I think we should go right, and you just acquiesce to me, well, at some point, it's either going to be right and you're going to feel a little weird about that, or it's going to prove that you were actually correct, at which point then, like, we're 2 miles down the line, we have to backtrack. Like, I would have much rather you brought it up at that why and said, I'm okay with this to go in your direction, but I think it's this direction.
Nice. That's good. One of the things sort of I've observed through the years is it's not really an idea, or it's I don't know, necessarily an operations thing, but it's the quality of the people running it. A good person who knows how to grow and inspire others could take any idea, or almost any idea, and make it successful. The idea of a law firm being successful, many have failed, some have succeeded. It's not the idea that succeeded, it's the individual driving it. Yeah. Have you seen any common characteristics amongst leaders within all the companies that you've worked with, that, I don't know, some quality that helps make the group better?
Yeah, humbleness of heart is kind of the biggest thing for me. And for me, I think there is that distinction between leader and boss. I mean, most people that, even from the way leadership is taught, I know a lot of people don't like the term servant leadership for a whole bunch of reasons. But for me, you're either a servant from a leader or you're a manager, because a servant leader shows up and says, look, my job, once I've hired you, my job is to show up every day because I hired you for a specific business purpose, for you to hit business outcomes, not necessarily to do the task the exact way, but to help the company reach an outcome. So my job every day, and every person in the hierarchy's job, should be to help say, how can I help the people that report to me be better in reaching the business outcomes that I want? Because we're all serving the client. Well, you either take that approach, or fundamentally underneath there is this little bit of like, even if you're the nicest person, do what I said in the way I said it, or you're fired. I mean, so that's leading from authority. That's
right.
Not a leader to me.
Right.
And so there are times where decisions have to be made, but leading from authority is a forcing of the decision. That's very different than the servant that says, hey, how do I show up every day, whether I'm at work or I'm at home?
How long do you have an average amount of time it takes to get a normal person up to a point where you can be sort of the servant to them versus the manager and controlling them?
It really does depend on the person.
That's a tough one.
Well, yeah,
it's tough.
Well, the biggest thing is, even me, if I came into your law firm, I approach myself as servant leadership. I speak around the world on the topic of servant leadership, whether I'm, that's the direct topic, or we're just talking about building high performing corporate teams. So underlying, do I think myself as a servant leader? Yes. But I also have PTSD from working for toxic bosses. And at some point, something's going to happen if I'm working for you, and it's going to trigger something in me, and I'm not going to respond in the way that I would like to. So, like, even if you hire somebody that has followed this path for decades, there's still going to be things that come up where you have to step in and go, hey, this is what's going on. And so depending on to some degree, so much PTSD somebody has had, it may take a lot more. I mean, I kind of thrive. You mentioned about hiring good people. I mean, I think my biggest thing from a hiring perspective, back to your question about like scaling, is most people will admit that when you hire people, they interview horribly. Well, if you're in a hiring position, you say most people hire interview. You ask most people, and they go, they would say that about themselves. I interview poorly. Well, then your job hiring people is to help pull out the superhero stories about who they actually are. And so, I have one woman who's working for me right now. She's worked for me for multiple companies. When I called her to make her the offer, she started the conversation by apologizing for not having such a great conversation and hoping and asking me to keep her in mind if I had another opening. And I'm like, that's not the conversation you're going to have. Yeah. Well, she has proven herself time and time again. So from a pure interviewing perspective, in those first rounds of interview, horrible from an interviewing perspective, but I saw the ingredients of who she was. And so that's my job, to bring in the good people and help make them better, hopefully.
You saw the ingredients of the good person she was. What would you like in the interview? You saw that, or references, or other, like, how do you judge character.
Both work product and in some case that she had this humbleness of heart.
Okay.
So she had never led people. And so that the same part of her that was apologizing for not having interviewed well said, you're going to be good leading people, or leading a process, because you're not just going to come in from an authority perspective.
That's cool. You say humbleness of heart, which I try to practice, and I think I do. But you look at characters and personalities like Steve Jobs or these, massive, strong personalities that just seem to push their way through no matter what. Maybe there was humbleness of heart there. I don't know a whole hell of a lot about him. But is there some sort of a balance between being a rimble and the servant versus being the manager and, getting your way and making sure it's going well?
There's definitely a balance because, at the end of the day, any revenue, and it's net revenue, not the revenue of the top line, it's the net revenue that the company earns. That's the lifeblood that keeps the company employed. And so if you don't have the balance to say, hey, look, if I have 40 people working my team or 4,000 people working my team, if this is not a going entity next year, all those families that are supported by those people are going to be out of work. So there does always have to be a balance. But I think there is that place of always coming and saying, am I trying to get you to be productive today, this week, this month, this quarter, this year, or for the next 5 years? Those are all very different things in how you would balance stepping in, coaching somebody, or demanding that they do something a specific way. The example I used, to your point about like balance. I had a gentleman who worked for me who got thrust into elder care. And very seldom do I find most people that it's coming, or it's coming, but it happens faster. So all of a sudden he's having help take care of an aging parent who can't take care of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say he was completely not useful for like 60 to 90 days, but he was damn well not productive like he had been. Well, even if I look at that 6-month period, still probably one of the best product managers that ever worked with me. If I look at his personality and how he performed over the year, probably still one of the top 1% of product managers that ever worked for me. But in that 60-day period, especially if in the week period where those highs and lows came, he might as well not even showed up to work just someday.
Right.
So from a leadership perspective, the good thing was he came and I knew what was going on, so we could help plan for that. Because sometimes things do go on longer. But so that's the balancing that says, okay, from a company perspective, this employee is a great employee. They have something going on right now, whatever it is in their personal life, kids, or something else. So there is that balance you have to come into, but those should be conversations that, from a humbleness of heart perspective, if people are comfortable having those conversations, then the business can plan for it and have conversations.
If you had let's just say a manager come to you, you're his boss, and he says, Kurt, I don't know how to draft this next plan for my team underneath me. Do you think I should do A, or do you think I should do B? Would you answer that question as his superior, or would you put it back on him?
I'm going to put it back on him.
Yeah.
I may bring in, depending on what the response is, I may bring up, have you thought about type of questions based on my experience. But I will try as best as possible to not give the specific dictated, this is what you should do.
Yeah.
And some of that, it does depend on the authority or how long I've worked with somebody as well. I have several people I've worked with where I've worked with them growing companies so well, where I would come in that case, maybe I would give an advice, even if my idea was only 5% or 10% better.
Yeah.
But I found from an authority perspective, most people, myself included, if I'm working for you, like, you should always step in if you have advice that would improve me in the role by 50% or more.
Yeah.
Which you may have. But if you have advice that's 5%, 10%, 15% improvement, the deflation that happens in that person so often, as opposed to letting them come to it themselves or saying, hey, next time when you do this, let me pull up alongside of you and do it with you. And then you're coaching them how to do that. That's so much better than I find just telling somebody, here's what you need to do. Now, there are situations in triage where, depending on the deadline, you have to just say, do it this way. And that's okay.
Yeah.
And in some cases, you may have a very strong opinion. I have a wonderful CEO I work for right now that has some very strong opinions on brand and certain things in marketing. He's also been really good at things before. So he has no problem if I push back on certain things where he steps in and says, do this. But usually he's like, hey, I have an idea.
Wow. That's cool. Okay. All right. Let me say, like I said, I've read it over your bio. There's so many successes. It's hard to go over everything. You said the $1.44 billion was the largest company. That is truly amazing. So congrats on that. You also mentioned, though, there have been failures. And I think sometimes that gets lost in all the successes because we see the success, but we don't understand what all that person has been through to get there, to be successful. So could you give us an example of one of the failures that you've gone through?
I mean, I've gone through a ton of failures. I kind of like to joke. I've had so many failures, most people would crawl underneath the table and die.
Yeah.
And so some of those examples are, I think about things like I've helped start a couple of companies. And we spoke about before the show. I don't like to start companies. I'm usually better adding zeros onto the end of things. But I started companies, and some of the initial people I hired were friends, but people I had some questionable character thoughts on.
Okay.
But they were great on their numbers at previous companies. Head of sales, like they just killed it. But I always had this little bit of thing that was like, yeah, but I'm not sure if I could trust this person by checkbook type of thing. And so what happened then later on? Well, it ends up proving themselves out through actions, both not performing well in the company, having several issues come up from an employee perspective where we had women step forward and say, I'm not comfortable in some of the situations that we've been put in.
Oh, wow.
And I found out years later that he was working on his own company trying to start as a side hustle. And it was at a time where it was like, wait a second, you're supposed to be working 50 to 60 hours a week here while we're at this place. That was on me for, we lost millions and millions of dollars of sales. Because
What kind of company is this? I'm sorry.
This was a technology company.
Tech company, okay.
And so there's been places like that where it's like I chased the dollars because I saw the numbers that this person can sell versus thinking about maybe there's some questionable character issues. But in the bigger things, like I step into things where, I mean, I've failed marriage, my initial marriage, because my God was accolades at work and hitting the next numbers. And hey, we did an IPO, we sold that company later. And it was like, I mean, I did everything except for have an affair or get heavily into drugs or alcohol to fail that marriage. And so that's also caused me to look back and say, gosh, during that time period, and you mentioned like Steve Jobs before, I try approaching my life now that says, gosh, if my wife and kids knew every decision, every conversation I had at work or elsewhere, and the effects of those people, of those decisions on people's families, would they be comfortable with it? Doesn't mean I haven't had to fire people, but it should never be a surprise. And so I look back at times, I was like, yeah, I helped make people millionaires that still won't take my phone call today because of the type of boss that I was.
Really?
Yeah. So for me, those are bigger failures than any of the work things. But I mean, I've had so many work failures. I mean, we probably could just start listing them off. So
It's funny. One of an old friend of mine, he worked for this very successful attorney. And before the attorney got successful, he would call in to work. And the attorney, he'd be like, where are y'all? And his boss would be like, oh, yeah. We're not in that building anymore. Come across the street and come upstairs. We're in this building. And basically, they just kept getting foreclosed on, or excuse me, evicted, because they couldn't pay. But the point is, failure was no longer a big deal. He didn't like, oh my gosh, we're getting evicted. He was just like, okay, next one, let's roll. Yeah. And then he had success in the mission solely in his mind.
Right.
So he just could shrug it off.
Yeah. Well, and you do have to learn from the mistakes that you made.
Sure.
Like my wife and I had a marketing agency where we had one client that we just loved the person as an individual, but they just kept missing payments. And every once in a while they would make a little bit of a payment. So finally we were tracking it, but it was one of those things like they'll pay eventually. So finally we looked at it and we're like, okay, next month they will cross $100,000 that they owe us for services. And so we stopped it that month. It never should have got to that number. And so looking back, and especially counsel I give to others, they're like, there is times that you give grace to period, but that was clearly like a business failure. I mean, that's a lot of money. And so like, we just knew we were never going to get it back. Well, what did I find out later? Well, there were several software engineers that hadn't been paid. And so the same type of thing, it's like, would those people have been impacted differently if even our marketing firm would have stepped up at, $20,000 in debt and said, you have to pay your dues?
Right. Let me go back. The first example you gave, you said you hired some friends, all of the guys with sales, and then he started his own side hustle and all.
Yeah.
Was there actions during work or during the time you all worked together that looking back, you're like, you know what, now it makes sense why he was doing this or why he didn't show up to that meeting or why he didn't seem to care? Or was there any indications before?
Absolutely. So like, in the case of sales, I firm believer is if it's not in the CRM that's tracking all the sales calls and communications with people, if it's not in the CRM, it doesn't exist. But I kept giving this person grace because, hey, you've been the top salesperson before, so you're going to be my top salesperson. And so some cases you might not have the right product,
Right.
but you have to have so many at bats and calls with customers and be told no before you realize that. And so could we figure that out earlier before we eventually made our pivot, which had a successful exit?
That's a good, okay. So, all right. So your CRM, client relation management, okay. That software, if this guy was supposed to call a client, even if he got rejected, he put in the CRM, I called a client, they said, hell no.
Right.
Moving on to the next. Yep. Just make some, so he just didn't enter any of his data.
Just didn't enter any of the data. I mean, I entered some, but not enough. And it basically gave the excuses of I don't have time. And at past companies, like I was brought in a company here in town called Vitro, and I always wanted to bring in that firm CRM kind of, if it's not in there, it doesn't matter. And Reggie, the CEO, who became my later mentor, he was like, look, I always give grace to one person on the sales team. That's whoever is in number one for the month or the quarter. I don't care if it's in the CRM or not, but everybody else, it matters.
Really?
And which was kind of a nice, I mean, I could see that approach. And so we had like our inside sales team and kind of dialing for dollars, so to speak. I mean, one gentleman, some cases he was twice, 3 times everybody else's numbers in a month. So did you really care what that person was doing? Not necessarily, but for everybody else, you did. Looking back, I'm like, well, no, everything should be in there because what else could others have learned? Well, I knew because I was in the office, I was single at the time, that I knew that this salesperson, not only did he start at 8 o'clock or so in the morning, some cases maybe 10 o'clock, in case he had a hangover. But what he did was when it hit 5:30 and everybody else starts heading home, he would go out to restaurant, have a couple of drinks, and then he would come back to the office and go, what parts of the world are still open right now? So he would start calling Europe and he would start calling the Middle East. And so if I got to see him, so we did start other people doing it, but none of those numbers were necessarily in the CRM, but it's like, well, he's in Atlanta, Georgia, making sales to Qatar. Why? Because he said, I just realized who would be awake right now that would be answering the phone call. There's businesses in Qatar that I can call.
That's amazing. See, that's fascinating to me because that goes to a question I think we all have to face. If you've got somebody that's extremely productive, how much forgiveness do you give them on other areas? How much does it matter? Because hell, they're producing. That's the goal. I'm just curious how somebody as successful as you would handle a situation like that, because we would probably get slack too and be like, okay, well, shit, she's doing great.
I think you have to define like where the grace is. And so like, I wouldn't necessarily do that for a team, but I might do that for an outlier type of thing or somebody in a time period. Usually what I'm going to come back is I'm going to say, well, if they're so far outperforming others, I want to learn from them and understand what they're doing.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest mistake that I've made in the past that I think many of us have is somebody who's so performing well in their job and we promote them.
That is so fun. I was about to ask you that.
Yeah.
Right. The producers aren't always good managers, are they?
Right. And a lot of times they'll accept it, but if you go back, they didn't want that responsibility. They loved what they were doing in their role, or they didn't fully understand what it would mean and what it would change from their life to move from this role. Like the thing that I hate the most about being a chief marketing officer, chief growth officer, running sales as well at companies is I like doing marketing. I like writing. I like talking to PR people. I like social media posts and doing graphics. I like the physical tasks of doing marketing. I love talking to customers. And what do I get to do the least? Those things. And so I do budget some of that in my time because it keeps my energy up and it keeps me connected to things. But it's like, okay, if you went back over time and said, hey, what would you have done differently? Like, I kind of look back at things and I'm like, the worst advice I ever got was my high school guidance counselor that told me I needed to go to college. I mean, when I went to college, I sold a lawn care business for 6 figures because I had enough employees and a book of business at that time. Well, how much money would I have made? And my risk would have been very different if somebody would have said, you just need to provide for your family, even though you don't have that, and stay with what you're doing. God, that would have been a great business at that time.
Right. It's so funny that carries us off into another tangent, because my son and I, he's 12. He's listening to Andrew Tate and all these YouTubers and stuff, some of which I agree with. And he is completely convinced that college is useless because he hears this over and over. And I'm like, maybe, but maybe not. It depends on what you want and what you make of it, that kind of a thing. But you said you said you did not, you
I did.
You sold your business and went to college.
I sold my business and went to college, but I dropped out of that first school. I was an athlete at Vanderbilt and dropped out.
Oh, wow.
So,
But you were so driven. Like, I don't know that it's for everybody. Some people might need that time to figure their life out or whatever the hell
so you may need a time to figure it out. I like the idea that I've heard from some people. And my wife and I only have a 5-year-old and almost 3-year-olds. Okay. Like, you're way further advanced than even we are. But I've heard, and so we started a 529 plan because Kentucky's going to go to college. But I've heard a number of people that says what they're starting to do is they're putting money aside for the kids. That says when they become 17, 18, what they're going to do is, and we're talking about this. We've not decided to do this, but I have friends that have done this. They basically say, hey, look, like, you have $200,000. You could go to college or you could start a business with it. I'm not going to make that decision by myself. And so as your son, you put 3 to 5 people around as almost a mini board that he has to make his pitches to about what he should do with that, he or she should do with that money. And I love the idea because, hey, college could be provided for, or if you want to go start a business, well, that could be a great path going forward, whether it's a kind of shovel-ready job like landscape or starting a software company. I mean, I would much rather hire somebody that, from a marketing perspective, that has never gone to college, but has been doing social media, working for a small company, for 5 years. I'd much rather hire that person, and I'll pay him more.
Right. I think probably 85% of the people in our firm are not college graduates. So, yeah, that the meaning has certainly deteriorated. Yeah, that's what I've told my lawyer. His name's Reese, and I'm like, if you're driven, if you know what you want, I'm not going to let you get out and find yourself, quote unquote, for 3 years. Like, you got to have a vision and pursue it, diligently. So, yeah, we'll see. He's still got a little time. He's 6th grade, so we'll see what happens. All right, before we're going to run out of time, all right, the $1.44 billion company, what kind of company was that?
So that was called Navtech. So we think about MapQuest back in our day, Garmin devices, all car navigation systems. We were the data and both the mapping data and the traffic data from everything from a random McNally paper map to a car navigation system, or my company. And it also, we did change how video games like Microsoft Flight Simulator and racing games were built. And so underlying all of that was this data that we collected around the country. Then
how do you collect all that? You just send people out everywhere to map it all out?
A lot of different ways. So you do send people out, like now Google collects our maps. And so you may see a Google Street View car ride by, but you collect a lot with satellites. And then they also track our cell phones. And then that gives them, hey, this is now a no turn on left because we don't see any phones turning left on this.
That's how they
track's one of the ways that they track it. So you track it a lot of different ways. It used to be originally, we always sent people out everywhere. And so they'd collect like 200 to 500 different points of data on any segment of road by being on that road. Well, now you can collect so much of that remotely or basically through satellite.
Did you do this all throughout the planet, or is this just the United States?
All around the planet. I mean, so except for we did collect in China, but in China, GPS coordinates are considered a state secret. So you have to partner with somebody that the Chinese government allows. And so we had a joint venture there.
Jeez.
But yeah, we had like 120 countries, I think, at the time. So
that's amazing.
It was kind of fun. I mean, it was at that place too where the company was like almost 20 years old when I joined. The former CFO of Disney as a whole, he was the president of Disney theme park. It was kind of his retirement gig as a CEO until he got in there and was like, shit, this could be a big company. He ended up later becoming a mentor of mine based on some of the things that had happened at the company. But like at that time, car navigation systems were a big deal. This was like 2000. You need to pay $5,000 to add a car navigation system.
Right.
That's where much of the revenue was. Like nobody thought about smartphones then. And we would open up video games and we would open up all these other things that you could do with it. So we were like at the nexus of 11 industries that were starting to use spatial data. And so to your point about like how many people make money from a force of nature, I mean, we could probably variety of us could go back and write a book about how do you lose $1 billion a year. We made stupid decisions, but we kept growing.
Wow.
Because largely the industry was growing. So
it's the right time. Time and all.
I mean, we made a lot of good decisions as well.
Sure.
Implemented well.
Well, you have to if you're that successful. Yeah, that's not an accident. Yeah. Not luck. Okay, cool. Well, listen, Kurt, thank you so much for your time, my friend. And congrats to all your success.
Well, thanks for having me.
No, you're welcome, man. You're welcome. All right, everybody. Thank you for being here and joining us for another Hines on Air. If you haven't already, click the subscribe button, like us, and please follow. If you have any questions or suggestions, please leave a comment. We'll see you next time.
Hines on Air is for you. Remember to subscribe, like, and leave a review whenever you listen to podcasts. Your support helps us reach more people and continue sharing these incredible stories.